June 19, 1953. Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York. At 8:11 p.m., the United States executed Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for conspiracy to commit espionage. They remain the only American civilians put to death for espionage during the Cold War. At that same moment, U.S. intelligence estimates placed the Soviet nuclear stockpile at approximately 120 atomic weapons, up from 0 just 4 years earlier. One convicted member of the same espionage conspiracy was not in the execution chamber. Morton Sobell, an American electrical engineer linked to the Rosenberg Network, was serving a federal prison sentence instead. Washington expected the executions to close the most dangerous espionage case in American history. Classified assessments show the opposite occurred. Analysts could not determine how much non-nuclear military and industrial intelligence had already crossed into Soviet hands. The central paradox remained unresolved. Had American justice eliminated the symbol of betrayal while leaving its most scalable mechanism untouched? By August 1945, the Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 personnel and consumed approximately $2 billion in federal funding. Converted to modern values, that represented roughly $30 billion. The program stretched across 3 primary sites: Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and Hanford in Washington state. Each facility operated under strict compartmentalization protocols designed by the War Department and enforced through military police presence, background investigations, and physical barriers. Public secrecy focused entirely on nuclear laboratories. Archival War Department audits from the period show that industrial contractors and electronics engineers operated under far lighter security controls. The Office of Scientific Research and Development coordinated thousands of subcontracts across American industry. Many involved classified military applications, radar systems, fire control electronics, military communications components. Yet security reviews remained inconsistent. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, responsible for military communications infrastructure, employed hundreds of civilian engineers with access to emerging technologies. Background checks were conducted, but surveillance was limited. The assumption held that atomic physics represented the critical vulnerability. Everything else fell into a secondary tier. The contrast was measurable. War Department security reviews from 1944 and 1945 documented strict protocols at Los Alamos, where armed guards controlled access points and scientists lived in isolated compounds. Office of Scientific Research and Development contractor reports from the same period show that electronics manufacturers operated with standard industrial security, locked facilities, identification badges, but no continuous surveillance or lifestyle monitoring. Protection centered on physics, while systems integration remained exposed. The most valuable intelligence was not the bomb. It was how modern war systems were built around it. Morton Sobell trained as an electrical engineer at the City College of New York during the late 1930s. He graduated in 1938 during the mobilization period preceding American entry into World War II. By 1944, Sobell was employed by General Electric, a key U.S. defense contractor involved in radar development, power systems, and military electronics manufacturing. Sobell held no atomic clearance. His name does not appear on Manhattan Project personnel rosters. FBI background investigations conducted decades later found no evidence that Sobell ever applied for or received access to nuclear weapons programs. Yet his professional access intersected with classified military electronics environments. Employment records from General Electric show that between 1944 and 1947, Sobell worked in divisions producing military fire control systems, the analog computing devices that aimed anti-aircraft guns and guided artillery. These systems represented cutting-edge electronics for the period. Later, Sobell moved to Reeves Instrument Corporation, another defense contractor specializing in military electronics. FBI investigative files compiled during 1950 documented Sobell's connection to Julius Rosenberg, a former U.S. Army Signal Corps engineer. Rosenberg had been dismissed from government service in 1945 after questions emerged about his political affiliations and associations with Communist Party members. Trial exhibits from 1951 show that Rosenberg and Sobell maintained regular contact throughout the late 1940s. Witnesses testified that the two men met frequently in New York City. The strategic value was indirect but cumulative. Employment records, FBI investigative files, and trial exhibits confirm these connections. Peripheral access created scalable intelligence value. Sobell did not enter restricted laboratories. He entered the supply chain. By 1948, FBI counterintelligence had identified multiple individuals linked to Julius Rosenberg. Surveillance summaries describe a network of engineers, machinists, and couriers operating primarily in New York City. Public narratives later reduced the case to two defendants, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. FBI memoranda from the investigation describe a dispersed technical network involving at least a dozen individuals. Julius Rosenberg had worked in the U.S. Army Signal Corps Inspection Division from 1940 to 1945. His position provided visibility into military electronics production across multiple contractors. He inspected radar equipment, communication systems, and fire control components manufactured by private companies under government contract. This role offered no direct access to classified designs, but it mapped the industrial ecosystem supporting American military capability. Ethel Rosenberg, his wife, was later alleged to have assisted in typing notes and coordinating communications between network members. Morton Sobell represented another node in the constellation. Harry Gold, a chemist who worked in industrial laboratories, served as a courier between multiple espionage networks, including one focused on atomic intelligence. Early Venona correlations, intelligence intercepts of Soviet communications decoded years later, confirmed that Soviet intelligence services operated multiple overlapping networks inside the United States during the 1940s. The NKVD, later reorganized into the MGB in 1946, and eventually the KGB in 1954, coordinated these operations from Moscow Center. Their objective was straightforward: accelerate Soviet technological development by acquiring American military and industrial intelligence across the widest possible spectrum. The impossible statistic appeared in declassified Venona summaries released during the 1990s. U.S. counterintelligence analysts estimated that Soviet intelligence maintained contact with over 300 individuals inside the United States during the mid-1940s. Not all were active agents. Many provided occasional information or served as talent spotters. but the scale exceeded anything American security planners had anticipated. FBI surveillance summaries and early Venona correlations document the network structure and resilience. Network redundancy increased operational security. If one node was exposed, others continued functioning. The conspiracy was wider than the courtroom ever showed. On June 16, 1950, Julius Rosenberg was arrested at his apartment in New York City. FBI agents had been building the case for months, following leads from earlier arrests in related networks. David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's younger brother, had been detained in mid-June. Greenglass worked as a machinist at Los Alamos during 1944 and 1945, and later provided detailed testimony that became central to the prosecution's case against his sister and brother-in-law. While Rosenberg remained in custody, Morton Sobell made a decision that would define his case. Travel records show that Sobell, his wife Helen, and their 2 young children crossed the U.S.-Mexico border on June 21, 1950, 5 days after Rosenberg's arrest. The family traveled to Mexico City under their own names. No effort was made to conceal the journey. Mexico City was a known intelligence transit zone during the early Cold War. Soviet intelligence maintained operational contacts there, and the city served as a waypoint for individuals moving between the United States and other destinations. American intelligence agencies monitored the city closely through the FBI Legal Attaché Office and CIA station, but jurisdictional limitations complicated direct action against U.S. citizens on Mexican soil. FBI cables from late June and early July 1950 document the Bureau's coordination with Mexican authorities. The FBI legal attaché in Mexico City worked with Mexican security services to locate Sobell and arrange his return to U.S. jurisdiction. Surveillance teams tracked the Sobell family's movements within the city. Mexican police maintained observation but did not immediately intervene. Travel records and FBI cables confirmed the timeline and the Bureau's response. Flight converted suspicion into operational priority. In counterintelligence terms, voluntary departure from the United States while under investigation constituted behavior consistent with consciousness of guilt. Movement confirmed intent. In mid-August 1950, Mexican federal police detained Morton Sobell and his family in Mexico City. The circumstances surrounding the detention remain legally contested even in a historical retrospect. Publicly, at the time and in subsequent official statements, the event was described as lawful extradition conducted in cooperation with U.S. authorities under existing treaties between the United States and Mexico. Court filings submitted by Sobell's defense attorneys during 1950 and 1951 documented procedural irregularities. Defense counsel argued that Sobell had been effectively abducted without a formal asylum hearing, without notification to legal counsel, and without adherence to standard extradition procedures that would have allowed him to contest removal. Witnesses later testified that Mexican police transferred Sobell directly to U.S. authorities at the border without formal deportation orders. State Department correspondence from August 1950 shows that U.S. officials prioritized Sobell's rapid return to American jurisdiction. Diplomatic cables emphasized the national security sensitivity of the case and the urgency of bringing Sobell back for questioning and potential prosecution. Mexican cooperation was secured, though the exact legal mechanisms remain unclear in declassified records. Some documents remain redacted or were never preserved in accessible archives. Sobell was transported across the border into Texas and immediately placed in FBI custody. He was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage under the Espionage Act of 1917. The legal challenge to his removal would continue through appeals for years, but it never resulted in dismissal of charges or suppression of evidence. Court transcripts and State Department correspondence document the contested process and the legal ambiguities. Speed prioritized over legal certainty. The urgency was strategic. FBI investigators believed Sobell possessed information about other network members who might still be active. The case returned to American jurisdiction. Its legality did not. The trial unfolded in March 1951 at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. Judge Irving Kaufman presided over proceedings that would become one of the most controversial trials in American legal history. The backdrop was significant and shaped public perception throughout. The Korean War had begun in June 1950, just weeks after Rosenberg's arrest. By March 1951, U.S. and United Nations forces were locked in brutal combat with North Korean and Chinese troops along a shifting front near the 38th parallel. U.S. defense spending was rising rapidly, from approximately $13 billion in fiscal year 1950 to over $50 billion by 1953, a nearly fourfold increase driven by mobilization for what many feared could escalate into World War III. Public anxiety over technological surprise was acute and well-founded. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, designated Joe 1 by American intelligence, in August 1949 at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. This event occurred at least 3 to 5 years ahead of American intelligence projections. The question of how the Soviets had closed the gap so quickly dominated national security discussions and fueled espionage investigations. The prosecution charged Julius Rosenberg, Ethel Rosenberg, and Morton Sobell with conspiracy to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union during wartime and peacetime. The indictment covered a period from 1944 through 1950. Critically for Sobell's case, no atomic blueprints, nuclear design documents, or Los Alamos materials were attributed to him in the indictment or during trial. The case against Sobell relied on associative testimony, travel records, and circumstantial behavioral evidence. David Greenglass, testifying under a plea agreement that spared him from a potential death sentence, described his own activities passing information from Los Alamos to Soviet couriers through his brother-in-law, Julius. He testified that Julius had told him about other engineers in the network, though Greenglass provided no direct testimony about Sobell's specific activities. Harry Gold, a chemist who had served as a courier for multiple Soviet intelligence operations, testified about the structure and methods of espionage networks he had participated in. His testimony established operational context, but did not directly implicate Sobell in atomic espionage. Max Elicher, an engineer and former classmate of Sobell's at City College of New York, provided the most direct testimony against Sobell. Elicher testified that in 1948, Sobell had driven him to a location in New York where Julius Rosenberg retrieved a film canister, allegedly containing classified information that Elicher had been pressured to provide. Elicher's testimony was disputed by the defense, which argued he had motive to cooperate with prosecutors to avoid his own indictment. Trial transcripts spanning more than 1,500 pages show that the evidence against Sobell was largely circumstantial. No physical documents, technical blueprints, photographs of classified materials, or other tangible evidence authored by or transmitted by Sobell were entered into evidence. No Soviet intelligence officers or handlers testified. No intercepted communications directly naming Sobell were presented. Federal prosecutors argued that Sobell's flight to Mexico demonstrated consciousness of guilt, an inference that his departure immediately after Rosenberg's arrest indicated he knew he was part of a criminal conspiracy. Defense counsel challenged the sufficiency of the evidence and the circumstances of Sobell's removal from Mexico, arguing that both the case and the defendant's return violated fundamental legal principles. Trial transcripts and Department of Justice case summaries document the evidentiary foundation and the legal arguments. The defense called character witnesses and challenged the credibility of prosecution witnesses. But Judge Kaufman's instructions to the jury emphasized that circumstantial evidence could support conviction if it established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Legal strategy substituted inference for documentation. The evidence was indirect, the consequences were not. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War files. On April 5, 1951, Judge Irving Kaufman delivered sentences that would define the case for decades. Julius Rosenberg was sentenced to death. Ethel Rosenberg was sentenced to death. Morton Sobell received 30 years in federal prison. The disparity was significant, deliberate, and reflected prosecutorial and judicial assessments of individual culpability and evidentiary strength. Public discourse in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and political speeches framed the defendants as equally guilty participants in a unified conspiracy that had betrayed atomic secrets to America's primary adversary. Media coverage throughout the trial emphasized the Rosenberg Network as a singular espionage apparatus responsible for accelerating Soviet nuclear capability. The executions were portrayed as necessary responses to an existential threat. Department of Justice memoranda from the trial period and subsequent appeals show a more nuanced internal assessment. DOJ officials differentiated technical roles and evidentiary thresholds among the defendants. Julius Rosenberg was identified in internal documents as the network's central organizer and recruiter, the individual who maintained contact with Soviet handlers and coordinated information transfers from multiple sources. Ethel Rosenberg's involvement was debated within the prosecution team. Some officials argued that her role was minimal and primarily supportive, typing notes, perhaps, facilitating meetings but not actively engaged in acquiring or transmitting classified information. Other prosecutors maintained that conspiracy law made her equally culpable regardless of the extent of her direct participation. The decision to seek the death penalty for Ethel was partly strategic. Prosecutors believed the threat might pressure Julius to cooperate and provide information about other network members. He did not. Morton Sobell occupied a peripheral position in prosecutorial assessment. He was linked to the conspiracy through Elicher's testimony and his own flight, but he was not accused of atomic espionage. No evidence suggested he had recruited others into the network or maintained direct contact with Soviet intelligence officers. His technical access involved military electronics, not nuclear weapons. Sentencing records document Judge Kaufman's lengthy statement explaining the sentences. He described the Rosenbergs' crime as worse than murder because it potentially endangered millions of lives. He stated that their actions had contributed to Soviet atomic capability and might have enabled communist aggression in Korea. For Sobell, Kaufman noted the serious nature of the conspiracy, but acknowledged the evidentiary differences. 30 years represented the maximum sentence short of death. The impossible statistic emerged from DOJ internal debates documented in declassified memoranda. Prosecutors estimated that even if all identified espionage networks were shut down, the Soviet Union would achieve nuclear parity with the United States within 10 to 15 years through independent scientific development. The question was not whether parity would occur, but whether espionage had compressed the timeline by 2 years, 5 years, or more. The answer would shape American security policy for decades. Sentencing records and Department of Justice internal memoranda confirm the differentiation and the strategic calculations. Punishment reflected evidentiary thresholds and prosecutorial judgment about individual culpability. 1 conspiracy, 3 radically different outcomes. Between 1951 and 1953, while appeals in the Rosenberg case proceeded through federal courts, U.S. intelligence agencies conducted comprehensive internal reassessments of Soviet nuclear progress and the contribution of espionage to that progress. CIA estimates revised Soviet nuclear development timelines by 2 to 3 years, acknowledging that the Soviet program had advanced faster than projections made during the late 1940s. Analysts at CIA headquarters in Washington and at the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, the military organization responsible for nuclear weapons deployment, concluded that the Soviet Union had developed atomic weapons capability substantially faster than American scientists and intelligence officers had predicted. Initial post-war estimates suggested the Soviets would not detonate a size working atomic bomb until the mid-1950s. Joe 1 in August 1949 invalidated those projections. Atomic espionage was blamed publicly and in congressional testimony. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British physicist who had worked at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, had been arrested in Britain in January 1950 and confessed to passing detailed nuclear weapons information to Soviet intelligence over a period of years. Fuchs provided comprehensive technical data about implosion designs, plutonium metallurgy, and weapon efficiency calculations. Theodore Hall, an American physicist who had also worked at Los Alamos, was later identified through Venona Decrypts as another source of atomic intelligence for the Soviets. Hall was never prosecuted. By the time Venona evidence became available, the legal window had closed, and prosecutors determined that Venona material could not be used in court without compromising the program. Hall's contribution was assessed as significant, possibly more valuable than some other sources because of his access to theoretical calculations and his scientific sophistication. The Rosenberg Network's specific contribution to atomic intelligence remained difficult to quantify precisely. David Greenglass's information, sketches and descriptions of implosion lens designs was later assessed by weapons scientists as crude and potentially misleading. Whether it provided actionable intelligence to Soviet weapon designers remains debated among historians. Internal reviews highlighted a broader problem: industrial leakage. Declassified CIA estimates and National Security Council briefings from 1951 through 1953 show that U.S. analysts increasingly recognized that Soviet intelligence had penetrated not just nuclear laboratories, but also the vast industrial base supporting military production. Electronics intelligence appeared repeatedly in these assessments. Soviet military equipment captured during the Korean War showed evidence of radar systems, communications equipment, and fire control components that closely resembled or incorporated design principles from American systems. Some components appeared to be reverse engineered from captured American equipment. Others suggested access to design documentation or technical specifications. Radar intelligence was particularly concerning. American radar technology from World War II and the immediate post-war period represented a significant advantage in air defense and early warning. If Soviet designers had access to American radar circuit designs, modulation techniques, and signal processing methods, they could accelerate their own radar development by years. Communications intelligence followed similar patterns. Secure military communication systems relied on encryption devices and frequency hopping techniques developed during and after World War II. Evidence suggested that Soviet intelligence services had acquired technical information about American communication security, though the extent remained unclear. The cumulative effect was strategic rather than dramatic. No single piece of industrial or electronics intelligence changed the balance of power overnight. But the systematic acquisition of technical information across multiple domains, radar, communications, fire control, aviation electronics, naval systems, represented a compression of development timelines that allowed the Soviet Union to narrow technological gaps faster than independent development would have permitted. Declassified CIA estimates and National Security Council briefings document the reassessment and the shifting focus. Counterintelligence recommendations emphasize broader vigilance across the defense industrial base, not just protection of nuclear laboratories. By 1953, the assumption that compartmentalization of atomic programs provided sufficient security had been replaced by recognition that American technological advantage depended on protecting an entire ecosystem. Counterintelligence focus began to shift from laboratories to systems, from physicists to engineers, from breakthrough weapons to industrial capacity. The damage exceeded the courtroom narrative. The Rosenberg trial had focused public attention on atomic espionage. Intelligence assessments showed that the threat extended far beyond nuclear weapons. At Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, on the evening of June 19, 1953, preparations for the Rosenberg executions proceeded according to established protocols. The death chamber, located in a separate building within the prison complex, held a single wooden electric chair manufactured in the 1920s. Prison electricians tested the equipment that afternoon. Execution voltage was set to deliver lethal current through 3 cycles: initial shock, pause, second shock, pause, final shock. Julius Rosenberg was executed first. He was led into the chamber at approximately 8:00 p.m. Witnesses included prison officials, representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office, a physician, and selected journalists. 3 cycles were administered. Julius Rosenberg was pronounced dead at 8:06 p.m. Ethel Rosenberg followed. She entered the chamber at approximately 8:11 p.m. Prison records indicate that the standard 3-cycle protocol was insufficient. Additional current was administered. Medical examinations showed continued heartbeat after the initial cycles. 2 additional shocks were required. Ethel Rosenberg was pronounced dead at 8:16 p.m. The executions were intended as closure, a definitive end to the most publicized espionage case in American history. U.S. Attorney General Herbert Brownell issued a statement within hours emphasizing that justice had been served, that the defendants had received fair trials and multiple appeals, and that their crime had warranted the ultimate penalty under American law. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover released a statement describing the Rosenbergs as traitors who had placed Soviet interests above American security. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had declined to grant clemency despite international appeals and domestic protests, issued a statement from the White House. He expressed regret that the executions had been necessary, but affirmed that the Rosenbergs' actions had jeopardized American lives and that the sentence was proportionate to the crime. Eisenhower noted that he had reviewed the case personally and consulted with Attorney General Brownell before making his final decision. Intelligence uncertainty persisted despite the finality of the executions. Contemporary intelligence assessments from CIA, NSA, and FBI counterintelligence divisions show that analysts remained unable to determine the full scope of information that had been transferred to Soviet handlers through the Rosenberg Network and related operations. The strategic questions were measurable but unanswered. Had the network provided information that accelerated Soviet atomic bomb development by 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? Had electronics and radar intelligence provided through Sobell and others materially improved Soviet air defense or communications capabilities? The intelligence community could not quantify the damage with precision. The Rosenberg Network had been dismantled. Julius Rosenberg was dead. Ethel Rosenberg was dead. David Greenglass was serving a prison sentence. Harry Gold was in federal custody. But the cumulative effect of their activities and the activities of networks that remained undetected could not be precisely measured through interrogation, through trial evidence, or through signals intelligence. Prison records and contemporary intelligence assessments document the execution procedures and the strategic disconnect. The public saw closure. Intelligence analysts saw gaps in knowledge that would persist for decades. Symbolic justice failed to resolve strategic questions. The case ended in the death chamber at Sing Sing. The accounting did not. Morton Sobell began his federal sentence immediately after sentencing in April 1951. He was initially held at the Federal Correctional Institution in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a medium security facility that housed white-collar criminals and nonviolent offenders. Within months, however, Bureau of Prisons officials decided that Sobell's espionage conviction warranted transfer to maximum security confinement. In 1952, Sobell was transferred to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, the island prison in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz housed the federal prison system's most high-risk inmates, individuals considered escape risks, violent offenders, or prisoners whose cases carried extraordinary security sensitivity. Sobell spent 5 years at Alcatraz, in a facility designed for isolation and control, rather than rehabilitation. Bureau of Prisons records show that Sobell maintained consistent behavior throughout his incarceration. He avoided disciplinary infractions. He participated in available work assignments. He did not publicly discuss his case, his trial, or his involvement in espionage activities. While imprisoned, Sobell had limited contact with the outside world. Letters were monitored. Visitors were restricted. Media access was denied. The contrast with public memory of the Rosenberg case was stark. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became symbols, martyrs to supporters who believed they had been wrongly convicted, scapegoats in a Cold War hysteria. To others, they remained traitors whose execution was justified. Their case generated protests, academic studies, novels, films, and ongoing historical debate. Morton Sobell faded from public attention. His name appeared occasionally in civil liberties publications and in appeals filed by his attorneys. But mainstream media coverage declined. The dramatic elements of his case, flight to Mexico, contested extradition, association with the Rosenbergs, were overshadowed by the executions. Sobell became a footnote. During these same years, U.S. counterintelligence doctrine evolved substantially. The Eisenhower administration, responding to intelligence assessments about the breadth of Soviet penetration, implemented comprehensive reforms aimed at preventing future compromise of sensitive programs. Lifestyle audits became standard procedure for individuals with access to classified information. Financial records, travel histories, personal associations, and behavioral patterns were systematically reviewed. The assumption that background investigations conducted at the time of hiring provided sufficient assurance was replaced by continuous monitoring. Access to classified information was mapped more rigorously across government agencies and defense contractors. Compartmentalization protocols were tightened, but the tightening extended beyond nuclear programs to encompass the entire defense industrial base. Engineers working on radar systems, communications equipment, aviation electronics, and naval technologies were subject to enhanced scrutiny. Counterintelligence training expanded. Personnel were educated about recruitment techniques used by foreign intelligence services, about the indicators of compromise, and about reporting procedures for suspicious contacts or activities. The FBI's counterintelligence divisions grew substantially during the 1950s, with field offices dedicating specialized agents to monitoring defense contractors and technical facilities. The Kennedy administration continued these reforms and added new dimensions. Polygraph testing became more widespread, though its reliability remained debated within the intelligence community. Technical surveillance, wiretaps, physical surveillance, mail monitoring, expanded under legal authorities granted through national security provisions. Bureau of Prisons records document Sobell's silence and his institutional trajectory. Absence of disclosure delayed institutional learning. Had Sobell cooperated with FBI interrogators or provided information about network operations, counterintelligence analysts could have refined their understanding of Soviet collection priorities and operational methods. His silence meant that lessons were drawn from other sources, defectors, Venona Decrypts, and surveillance operations, rather than from direct testimony. Silence became a data point in itself. Intelligence analysts noted that individuals involved in ideologically motivated espionage often maintained operational security even after conviction and imprisonment, in contrast to financially motivated spies who frequently cooperated to reduce sentences or improve prison conditions. Between 1995 and 1999, the National Security Agency began releasing portions of the Venona Project Decrypts, one of the most significant and closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. For more than 50 years, the existence of Venona had been classified at the highest levels of American intelligence. Even most senior government officials were unaware of the program during its operational years. Venona represented a cryptanalytic breakthrough and a sustained intelligence operation spanning decades. Starting in 1943, the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service began intercepting Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications transmitted between Moscow and Soviet establishments in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. The communications used one-time pad encryption, a system considered theoretically unbreakable if implemented correctly. Soviet intelligence made critical procedural errors. Some one-time pads were reused due to wartime pressures and production constraints. This reuse created patterns that American cryptanalysts could exploit. The work was painstaking. A team of analysts at Arlington Hall in Virginia worked for years on individual messages. Some messages were never fully decrypted. Others yielded fragments, a code name, a date, a reference to a meeting, or a transfer of materials. By the late 1940s, Venona analysts had identified evidence of extensive Soviet espionage operations inside the United States. The Decrypts revealed networks focused on atomic intelligence, political intelligence, military strategy, and technical industrial intelligence. Codenames appeared repeatedly, individuals whose true identities remained unknown to American counterintelligence. FBI counterintelligence used Venona leads to guide investigations, but the program's existence could never be revealed in court. Evidence derived from Venona could not be used in prosecutions because disclosure would alert the Soviets that their codes had been compromised. This created an operational dilemma. Investigators knew who some spies were, but could not always build independent cases that would stand up in court without revealing Venona. The Rosenberg investigation benefited from Venona leads. Decrypts identified Julius Rosenberg under the codename Liberal and later Antenna. Messages described his activities recruiting engineers and transmitting information to Soviet handlers. The Decrypts corroborated David Greenglass's testimony and provided strategic context that helped investigators understand the network structure. When NSA began releasing Venona materials during the 1990s, historians and intelligence analysts gained access to primary source intelligence documents that had shaped Cold War counterintelligence operations. The releases confirmed decades of historical debate about Soviet espionage in the United States. The Venona releases confirmed Soviet penetration of U.S. technical sectors on a scale that exceeded even pessimistic assessments from the 1950s. Dozens of individuals were identified through codenames in the Decrypts. Some had already been prosecuted or publicly exposed during their lifetimes. Julius Rosenberg, Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold. Others had never been publicly identified and had lived out their lives without facing legal consequences. Julius Rosenberg appeared extensively in Venona Decrypts. Messages described his recruitment activities, his meetings with Soviet handlers, and his coordination of information transfers from multiple sources. His role as a network organizer and his commitment to Soviet intelligence objectives were unambiguously documented. Morton Sobell's name did not appear directly in the released Venona materials, though this absence does not definitively exclude his involvement. Venona coverage was incomplete. Many messages were never intercepted. Many intercepted messages were never decrypted. And many decrypted messages were only partially readable. Individuals linked to Sobell through trial testimony and FBI investigation did appear in some decrypts, establishing the broader network context. The decrypts clarified scale but not all individual roles. They demonstrated that Soviet intelligence operated broad systematic networks focused on military-industrial intelligence, not just atomic secrets. Electronics appeared repeatedly as a collection priority. Radar technology was explicitly mentioned in multiple messages. Communications equipment, aviation electronics, and naval systems were all targeted. One decrypt from 1944 described Soviet intelligence priorities for technical collection in the United States. The message listed radar as a top-tier priority, comparable to atomic intelligence. Fire control systems were identified as valuable. Military communications encryption was flagged as a critical target. The message demonstrated that Soviet intelligence viewed American technological superiority as a comprehensive challenge, requiring broad collection across multiple domains. The impossible statistic emerged from systematic analysis of released Venona materials. NSA and FBI analysts estimated that Soviet intelligence maintained active contact with over 300 individuals inside the United States during the mid-1940s who provided information, facilitated operations, or served intelligence functions. Most were never prosecuted. Many were never identified. Some held minor roles and provided limited information. Others occupied positions that gave them access to highly classified programs and provided material intelligence value over years. National Security Agency Venona releases document the breadth and the gaps in Cold War counterintelligence knowledge. Historical reassessment replaced assumptions. Cases that had been debated for decades, the extent of penetration, the value of information transferred, the number of individuals involved, could be evaluated against primary source intelligence documents rather than trial testimony and competing narratives. Closed files reopened decades later. But even Venona did not answer every question. The history of Cold War espionage remained incomplete. Morton Sobell was released from federal prison on January 14, 1969, after serving 18 years and 3 months of his 30-year sentence. He had been granted parole by the U.S. Parole Commission based on institutional behavior and time served. At age 51, Sobell returned to New York and resumed civilian life. For decades following his release, Sobell publicly maintained his innocence. He stated repeatedly in interviews, in legal filings, and in public appearances that he had been wrongly convicted, that the evidence against him at trial had been insufficient, and that his extradition from Mexico had violated legal and constitutional principles. He argued that he had been caught in Cold War hysteria, prosecuted by association rather than by evidence, and sentenced as a message rather than as justice. His case became a focus for civil liberties organizations and legal reform advocates who questioned the fairness of Cold War espionage prosecutions. The National Committee to Reopen the Rosenberg case, formed in the 1970s, included Sobell's conviction in their advocacy. Legal scholars published articles analyzing the evidentiary standards applied in the Rosenberg-Sobell trial and questioning whether circumstantial evidence and associative testimony should have been sufficient for conviction under conspiracy law. Sobell's consistent denials shaped historical memory. Supporters viewed him as a victim of injustice who had spent nearly 2 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit. Skeptics noted his flight to Mexico and his associations with confirmed spies and maintained that his conviction was justified regardless of the specific evidence presented at trial. In September 2008, at age 91, Morton Sobell gave an interview to the New York Times. He acknowledged for the first time that he had engaged in espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union. He stated that during the late 1940s, he had passed classified military information to Soviet contacts arranged through Julius Rosenberg. He specified that the information involved military electronics, radar-related technologies, and fire control systems, technical intelligence rather than atomic secrets. Sobell described his motivation as ideological rather than financial. He stated that he had believed the Soviet Union represented a progressive alternative to capitalism and that sharing technological information would help create a more balanced international system. He acknowledged that his beliefs had been shaped by Depression-era politics and by wartime alliance between the United States and Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. He maintained specific limits to his admission. He denied involvement in atomic espionage. He stated that he had never possessed access to nuclear weapons information and had never transmitted such information. He characterized his activities as less serious than those attributed to Julius Rosenberg and far less serious than the activities of scientists like Klaus Fuchs, who had direct access to Los Alamos research. He also stated that Ethel Rosenberg had not been involved in espionage activities and that her conviction and execution had been unjust. This claim aligned with historical evidence that had emerged from released documents showing that Ethel's role had been minimal and that prosecutors had used the threat of her execution to pressure Julius to cooperate, a strategy that failed. Venona Decrypts, partially released by 2008, corroborated aspects of Sobell's account. They confirmed Soviet intelligence's systematic interest in non-nuclear military technologies during the period when Sobell was active. They confirmed that networks like Rosenberg's focused on broad technical intelligence gathering across multiple domains. They confirmed that ideologically motivated individuals provided intelligence without direct financial compensation, complicating the profile that American counterintelligence had developed for identifying potential spies. The admission came 57 years after his flight to Mexico and 59 years after the events he described. Published interviews and archival cross-references document the late acknowledgement and its limited scope. Late admissions reshaped historical judgment, but did not resolve all debates. Questions persisted about the strategic value of the information Sobell transmitted, about the extent of his activities beyond what he acknowledged, and about whether other individuals in similar positions had escaped detection entirely. Truth arrived long after consequence. The legal case had concluded decades earlier. The individuals most directly affected, the Rosenbergs, were long dead. The Cold War had ended, but the admission provided a data point for historical understanding of how espionage networks operated and how individuals rationalized participation in activities they knew were illegal. By the 1960s, U.S. counterintelligence had expanded far beyond the assumptions and procedures of the 1940s. The institutional changes that followed the Rosenberg case and the broader revelations about Soviet espionage operations reshaped how American intelligence and security agencies approached the protection of classified information and sensitive technologies. Lifestyle audits became routine for personnel with access to classified programs. The concept was straightforward. Individuals granted security clearances would undergo periodic reinvestigation that examined financial status, foreign travel, personal associations, and behavioral indicators that might suggest vulnerability to recruitment or compromise. The assumption that initial background checks provided enduring assurance was replaced by continuous monitoring throughout an individual's career. Technical access was mapped systematically across government agencies and defense contractors. Security officers developed detailed matrices showing which personnel had access to which specific programs, which facilities, which technical areas. Compartmentalization was enforced not just within laboratories, but across entire supply chains. An engineer working on radar components might have access only to the specific subsystem relevant to their work, not to broader system architecture or integration. These reforms were formalized through executive orders, Department of Defense directives, and intelligence community policies developed during the 1950s and 1960s. Senate reviews of intelligence failures, including the Rosenberg case, the loss of U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers over the Soviet Union in 1960, and other compromises, led to legislative oversight and institutional reforms that persisted through the remainder of the Cold War. Counterintelligence policy reforms documented in declassified records show a fundamental shift in security culture. The post-World War II assumption had been that America's technological advantage was inherent, and that protecting breakthrough weapons, atomic bombs, then hydrogen bombs, then intercontinental ballistic missiles, was sufficient. The Rosenberg case and subsequent assessments demonstrated that advantage was cumulative and systemic. Security shifted from laboratories to ecosystems. Protecting the Manhattan Project required securing Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford. Protecting American military technological advantage required securing thousands of contractors, tens of thousands of engineers, hundreds of research institutions, and entire communications and logistics networks. The impossible lesson was quantified through Cold War outcome analysis conducted after 1991. Defense analysts and historians calculated that Soviet military technological development during the Cold War proceeded approximately 3 to 7 years faster than independent development would have predicted, based on Soviet scientific capacity, industrial base, and resource allocation. Not all of that acceleration derived from espionage, reverse engineering of captured equipment, open scientific literature, and independent innovation all contributed. But systematic intelligence collection across multiple domains provided consistent advantage that compressed timelines. Morton Sobell's case demonstrated that strategic parity is shaped not only by singular breakthroughs, but by cumulative technical erosion across industrial systems. A single atomic blueprint, Klaus Fuchs's contribution, represented a discrete, measurable loss of specific nuclear weapons design information. But the systematic transfer of electronics intelligence, radar technology, fire control systems, and communications infrastructure over years represented something different. A compression of the learning curve that allowed Soviet engineers to avoid dead ends, to adopt successful approaches, and to allocate resources more efficiently. The distinction mattered for policy. Preventing another Klaus Fuchs required better security at nuclear laboratories. Preventing another network like the one involving Sobell and Rosenberg required transforming how the entire defense industrial base approached security, how personnel were vetted and monitored, how information was compartmentalized, and how technical advantage was understood, not as discrete secrets to be locked away, but as ecosystems to be protected. The Rosenbergs were executed on June 19, 1953. Morton Sobell survived and eventually returned to civilian life. The paradox that confronted American counterintelligence on that night in 1953 was eventually resolved, but not through punishment. It was resolved through institutional change, through recognition that the mechanisms allowing peripheral access to become strategic leakage required systematic reform. The Cold War did not end because one conspiracy was prosecuted or because two individuals were executed. It continued for nearly 4 more decades. During those decades, American counterintelligence adapted, tightened procedures, expanded surveillance, and built institutional frameworks designed to prevent the kind of broad technical penetration that Soviet intelligence had achieved during the 1940s. Whether those frameworks succeeded completely is unknowable. Espionage is characterized by successes that remain secret and failures that eventually surface. What is documented is that American technological advantage persisted through the Cold War, that the Soviet Union never achieved comprehensive military technological parity despite decades of effort, and that by the time the Cold War ended, the gap had widened rather than closed. Morton Sobell's case illustrated a principle that shaped Cold War security policy. Advantage is cumulative, erosion is incremental, and protection requires vigilance across entire systems, not just at the most obvious points of vulnerability. Counterintelligence policy reforms and Senate oversight reviews document this transformation. Security shifted from laboratories to ecosystems, from singular secrets to systemic integrity. The lesson was hard-learned and costly, but it was learned. Sobell's case demonstrated that strategic parity is shaped not only by singular breakthroughs, but by cumulative technical erosion across industrial systems. In the end, the spy who survived the electric chair became a lesson in how nations protect not just their weapons, but the entire foundation of their technological advantage. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War Files.